The issue of man-made climate change came to the Texas Capitol. Two high-ranking spokesmen for the Center of Naval Analysis spoke of climate change as a national security threat. Rear Admiral Neil Morsetti.
If we act in a coherent and coordinated fashion, not only will we reduce the risk posed to national security and the calls upon our respective armed forces, but we'll enjoy the economic benefits and the better quality of life that comes with that. And I'd just like to conclude by saying there is no security solution to climate change, just greater insecurity if we don't act. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sounds reasonable, right? I don't have a problem as long as he doesn't call for a carbon tax.
Within Europe as a whole, money is coming from the emissions trading scheme, where there's a price on carbon. And
is that a tax, just a straight-up tax, or is it a credit?
To all intents and purposes, it is a tax. Yeah.
And there's the carbon tax. The carbon tax being something to encourage citizens to reduce their carbon emissions. Meanwhile, military conflicts leave huge carbon footprints, not to mention weapons for our enemies to use against us, but that's another story.
But the debate is settled. Climate change is a fact. And when our children's children look us in the eye and ask if we did all we could to leave them a safer, more stable world with new sources of energy, I want us to be able to say, yes, we did.
You've probably heard that before, that all credible scientists follow the narrative of man-made climate change. But as the founder of the Weather Channel points out, science isn't a consensus.
When you see the government, when you see NASA, when you see other institutions say that 97% of climate scientists agree, do you think they're making it up? What I don't understand is how you square that.
Well, that's a manipulated figure, and let me explain it to you. The government puts out about $2.5 billion directly for climate research every year. It only gives that money to scientists who will produce scientific results that support the global warming hypothesis.
And in that full debate, the CNN anchor pitted Mr. Coleman against the CEO of the Weather Channel, who is a businessman, not a scientist. But let's address some of the concerns by those who warn of climate change.
Greenland would also raise sea level almost 20 feet if it went. If Greenland broke up and melted, or if half of Greenland and half of West Antarctica broke up and melted, this is what would happen to the sea level in Florida. This is what would happen to San Francisco Bay. A lot of people live in...
Last I checked, that hasn't happened.
Scientists reported with unprecedented alarm that the North Polar ice cap is, in their words, falling off a cliff. One study estimated that it could be completely gone during summer in less than 22 years. Another new study to be presented by U.S. Navy researchers later this week warns it could happen in as little as 7 years. 7 years from now.
It's been more than 7 years since Gore stated that study, and that hasn't happened either. But I do appreciate him being bold enough to reference studies, because now climate change, quote, experts refuse to make any concrete predictions or forecast.
So when it's cold, should we then say, oh, no problem, don't worry about climate change?
No, let's not confuse or interchange climate change with global warming. The world is getting warmer. There's more carbon dioxide holding in more heat. So when the climate changes, some places get colder. And the thing that's really consistent with climate change models is this variance, where it's cold, it's warm, it's cold, it's warm.
I'll play that again so you can hear how he's coaching the anchor to be vague.
The world is getting warmer. There's more carbon dioxide holding in more heat. So when the climate changes, some places get colder. And the thing that's really consistent with climate change models is this variance, where it's cold, it's warm, it's cold, it's warm.
Don't say global warming, because if it's cold, people won't take you seriously. Don't say global cooling, because if it's hot outside, people are going to laugh at you. Use the all-inclusive term of climate change, so that way if it's hot, you'll be right. If it's cold outside, you'll be right. If it rains outside, you'll be right. If it's drought, you'll also be right. You may have heard that 2014 was the warmest year on record. I think they should add an addendum to that title, 2014, the warmest year on record with the exception of Chicago, Illinois, which was the coldest in 100 years. 2014, the warmest year on record, with the exception of the Great Lakes that froze onto the land masses. But remember, call it climate change, so regardless of whether it's hot or cold, you'll be right.
It's cold, it's warm, it's cold, it's warm.
Now, let's talk about melting ice.
Visual proof of Mendenhall's steady retreat.
Now, in the winter, will this come back?
The retreat will tend to slow down in the wintertime.
Okay.
And maybe it even stabilizes or creeps forward a tiny little bit. But boy, as soon as the warming season comes back on, it continues to gobble itself backwards.
I definitely do recognize that ice melted, but I also remember this.
Another new study to be presented by U.S. Navy researchers later this week warns it could happen in as little as 7 years.
So is it possible that ice melted and then refroze someplace else? Just like we saw the ice of the Great Lakes, it froze onto the landmass and then melted back into the Great Lakes, and I'm sure it will do it again. Later on in that same report, they blamed Hurricane Sandy damage on climate change. And as I'm sure any 12-year-old science student can tell you, there have always been floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, long before coal power plants, big oil, and SUVs. And to be clear, I'm not here cheerleading for big oil. I definitely recognize the BP spill and all the problems that caused. With that said, I make no money from big oil, but I also don't want to give my money to big carbon tax. You can find more reports on NoWorldOrder.com.